Okay, welcome everybody to the Critiquery. Tonight we have read a submission by Ian, which we're going to go over, and we'll start with the normal process. So everybody will get about a minute to say something positive, something they liked, which there's a lot to like in this, and also something that they'd like to talk about that we could potentially discuss. The piece could work on and maybe get a little better. Let's start with Ray.
All right. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm not really a zombie aficionado. I've actually never read any zombie stuff. I've just watched Walking Dead and like Night of the Living Dead and stuff like that. And usually the zombie is just this thing that is bad and you try to avoid. So I found it really interesting and somewhat compelling hearing the zombie perspective on the whole ordeal. And also just the way it was described was quite terrifying and very vivid. So it was very, created a lot of tension, I felt like. The one part I'd like to discuss more is the backstory, the hallucinogens, Peru, Gabe. Seems like that was pretty brief.
Thank you, Ray. Hey, Terry. All right, we got Terry. Fantastic. Brad, why don't you go next?
All right. Yeah, I had the pleasure of reading the entire novel that I think this is based on, or this might be in addition to, when we were in a focus group together, Ian and I and some other people. And so this, I've always liked this concept of, kind of a person being trapped inside a zombified shell, almost, having a person be a prisoner in their own body. I think that's an interesting idea. I found this piece really difficult to read, and that is a positive thing in this context, because that's my way of saying that I was definitely feeling a great deal of anxiety and tension and concern for the life of the wife and the child before the wife finally, succumbed to her wounds and the child was eaten by the parents. It was, kind of, it's also was not something I was looking forward to. But I definitely felt, it definitely captured my attention, that impending doom. And then I guess the one thing I would talk about, and I guess it's a common issue I have with any zombie story, I guess, is I really want a kind of a scientific reason for why there are zombies. And so for me to be really interested in this piece long term, I would need to know why, I mean, what the zombie process is. Is it a disease? Is it an alien? Is it, a nanobot? What's the, I mean, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense as to why the people would lose kind of control of their body and whatnot. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brad. That was great. Jared, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I thought that the eating scenes were disturbing, which is good, and they didn't feel familiar. I mean, I think that we've all either read, seen something like this, so it still felt new, with the way it was presented, with the person being inside the body, but unable to control it. And then something to talk more about would be maybe a little bit of what Ray was talking about with the beginning, and just whether there could be more of it or less of it. And yeah, thank you.
All right, Terry. What do you think? Something positive, something you liked, and something you want to talk more about?
I thought the writing was terrific. I thought scenes of reminiscence and poignancy were really well done. I guess maybe something more to talk about. I don't know if you're committed to the idea, to the zombie idea and being inside a zombie's head. I don't know there's much I could say to talk you out of it. I think there's problems with that whole approach. And I can so maybe talk more about that, about the central concept, which seems to be being inside of a zombie's head and lending it a lot of pathos. I think there's a problem with that concept at its root.
All right, thank you, Terry. That should definitely give us something to talk more about. On my end, yeah, like everybody, I would say the premise was tremendously interesting. I hadn't seen that before, and the way the author worked toward that was unexpected. I mean, you kind of get a handle on that it's going to be a zombie thing a little early, but how it's going to work itself out was definitely interesting. The the writing was certainly plot focused and moved us through a lot of tension and the stakes. I think the first time I felt really pulled into the story was when we realized he's going to his house and he's going to, we know that there's a child at risk and there's his loved one at risk, and those were just incredible stakes that were so vicious, which was appropriate to the narrative. The things I'd want to talk about, there's a couple things. The first one being the amount of characterization and just I guess the ratio of characterization to plot, maybe, in that there are these scenes of incredible pathos that are focused almost entirely on the body horror aspect of it, and there's these strong emotions that are maybe less focused on, that I thought could add a little bit to the tension and just to the weight of those scenes, so they're not necessarily purely about the viscera. And then I would say maybe the thoughts the protagonist has seem somewhat distant. He's thinking about life insurance while he's like murdering his kid, and there's a few moments that feel very much like a reflection of a guy months away from this horror that's sort of trying to comfort himself, as opposed to somebody in the direct act of placing their family in what is a living hell, right? So those are two things I don't want to talk about, but let's actually, Ian, let me ask you, would you rather focus on the few things that people brought up, or would you like us to go through your questions first?
That's a great question. I have a unique request, and you can certainly say no, but I would like to invite Brad to speculate as to what would be a compelling mechanism for the zombie infection, if you will. My design relies heavily on mycelium networks and fungal spores, and there being kind of a sentient microscopic fungus that's infecting the host there. But that was one of the things that I struggle with in creating this world, is to make a compelling reason for zombies to exist. So if I can sell Brad on it, then I can sell myself and therefore any other readers on it. But if you would prefer to go through the individual comments, then I think that would be sufficient. My questions can wait to the end. They're binary.
No, it's your time, Ian. Let Brad, can he put you on the spot? Do you have an idea about, Ian, just to clarify, are you talking about kind of the ant fungus thing where they climb up and then their heads explode and it spreads spores?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm looking at a humanized version of the ant zombie fungus that does other stuff because human.
Have you ever seen the X-Files episode about that? No, all right, that's totally beside the point. So Brad, what are your thoughts?
Well, that, and I think that, yeah, that I think that would work. And we probably wouldn't need to know it right away, I guess. So the thing I struggle with is you know, if it's a virus or a fungus, and well, in this case it's sentient, so that changes things. But if it's a virus or a fungus or any other kind of communicable disease, then there's probably no real reason for the violence and the aggression, unless you can, you know, somehow show that it's like a genetically modified version of like rabies or something that causes aggression even in its natural state. So I guess I would want, because I'm a science nerd, for there to be a believable reason for the aggression and for the biting of people as a vector for transmitting the disease or the mycelium into other hosts, and thus like spreading the network or growing the network and whatnot. So now in this case, I guess if it is, you know, if it's a sentient fungus, which I remember from focus group, and it is transmitted by saliva, then I'm okay with that. But I would think then that there might be, if it's sentient especially, then there's probably going to be more behavior exhibited by the bodies, or by it after it's taken control of the people. Like they're standing around in the apartment after, you know, they're all essentially lost control of their own bodies, and it sounded like it was a few days and they were just kind of like standing around the TV. And so I would think if it was an intelligent, sentient fungus, it would probably have understood at this point, like how to get out of the apartment, either by breaking a window or opening a door. And so I would that's something I think that would help me, is for the person inside the body to realize that, wait a second, you know, it's like, not only am I a prisoner in my body, but my body's doing things that like it shouldn't. Those are my initial thoughts. I don't really want to take up any more time monologuing.
No, that brings up actually a fantastic point about the ending, actually. And I know nobody brought this up, but now we're here. Let's give it a shot. How do we feel about the ending? Potentially, I guess, with something that Brad just brought up, which is the potential, I don't want to say plot hole, but unclear maybe part of how this infection can lead to aggressive action where the people are not in control anymore, but they end up hanging out in a house for what seems like days as they wait for help. So Ray, is that the impression you got? And second, did that feel weird to you at all?
So the whole sequence of the story, you know, I kind of framed it around the questions that Ian gave us about whether this would be a good hook or a good novella. And like I said, limited knowledge of zombie things, but generally the driving issues is get away from the zombie, or like Brad was saying, how did it happen? So for me, the ending doesn't seem like an ending, obviously. Perhaps it would be in a novella, but I feel like if it was a novella, the backstory would have to be developed more. I mean, rather than being a hook, that would just kind of be a hanging ending, kind of a dismal, you know, last bit. But if it was a novel hook, it seems like the whole Kevin biting people bit would be a better place to start, or not Kevin, Gabe biting bit. And then, you know, sometime later in the book, the backstory is explained. But with both premises I have is kind of the immediacy of the writing. You know, there's all the cracks and flumps, and you know, this Jim is just reliving this day over and over in his head, it seems. So, you know, looking at it as I came looking at it as an incomplete writing to begin with, just based on the questions. My question is, how do you incorporate more into it without breaking the narrative style of this first person, you know, traumatic telling of what happened? Because it seems like it'd be weird if after this happened, you just like, well, let me go back to my college days and tell you about all their drugs. And it'd also be, kind of less of a hook and less impactful if the whole story started with, well, let me tell you about me and Gabe and the drugs we did and the time in Peru. So I always looked at it as an incomplete story based on the prompts. And when I read it, I was definitely left wanting to know more. How you go about explaining more with what's written here, I'm not really sure.
That brings up so many good points. I definitely want to circle back to that, but let me see if anybody else has anything to say about the ending. Terry, did you have any thoughts on the effectiveness of the ending? Did it feel confused to you at all? Were you more like Ray, where you it didn't feel like an ending at all, or maybe more like Brad, where it just felt kind of like it didn't make a lot of sense plot wise?
It felt incomplete. But I didn't really have a sense of what it was building towards. And I didn't have a sense of flow because I was kind of rocked by, poignant passages, juxtaposed with, dreadful situation and not enough suspense or character volition to really push me through the amount of real estate that was devoted to horror. So I wasn't looking for something beyond, because I didn't see it going anywhere other than to underline, the triumph of horror or something like that. I'm not sure.
Well, let me follow up with you, Terry. When you say there wasn't enough suspense, we did hear a number of people, including myself, mention the tension. When you say suspense, do you mean? Well, I guess what do you mean by that?
Let me think about that.
All right.
I mean, I just, from the, I found the, I found the things for me started getting compelling once there started to be like the seizure in the plane and Gabe's seizure and this unexplained behavior and events surrounding that. And then once it became clear that we were in a zombie thing, I just found the whole issue of being inside of a zombie's head, especially the way it was being handled with full human sensitivity, a huge problem, because the effectiveness of zombie fiction that I can tell is the extent to which it's cartoonish. At least the zombies are cartoonish and are kind of like obstacles in a video game. And once that benefit is squashed, I don't know what you have left. So I was struggling with that, and so yeah, I wasn't getting invested like I probably need to in order to look forward to where this plot might be going.
Sure, I understand that. Jared, we were talking about the ending. How did you feel about the ending in terms of maybe did it make sense to you why the characters hung out in the room or in the house for a while? Did you feel it was complete?
Um, yeah, so I thought certainly I think like the instinct is to think that it doesn't make sense, and then the reader would have to then figure out a reason for it to make sense, which usually isn't a good thing to bet on. But I would guess that if it's a plant-based thing, that it doesn't know what a door is, it doesn't know what any of this stuff is, so it doesn't know how to use it, so it's just in there until someone comes in and opens a door, and then it'll, do something else. At the same time, I would say that the wife didn't seem to have the same effect as the husband did. The husband was bitten, had a bit of time where he was still in control of his body, could still drag himself around and do things. The wife seemed to wake up, maybe because she was actually, I don't know. She woke up and was already immediately, it seemed, straight to where he ended up. But yeah, I would say I was confused by it. And then in terms of completeness for the ending, I think that this is one of the questions that Ian asked about novel or short story or novella. Uh, and I know that Ian had mentioned that it would be with different characters, and at first I was kind of wondering about that. But then, I mean, I think it would be hard to sustain this for some of the reasons maybe that Terry mentioned. I'm not sure if they're the same reasons, but for the idea that it seems hopeless, it seems like there's, I mean, he mentions it here, but we certainly don't have any understanding that there will be. He can't, it seems that they're dead. I mean, from our understanding of zombies, although he disputes that at some point. So I think there's a lot up in the air. So it didn't seem complete because the internal logic of the story wasn't there enough for me to understand what was going on in this. Like what we have here, if this was all there was, I would be left confused as to how things worked and why things went certain ways. Yeah, so I guess that answers that.
Are there any details that would, because as you were talking, I was wondering if the character felt himself, if he felt the intelligence of the mycelial network and how stupid it was, or himself battling it. Like, what I mean is there any kind of internal reflection or simple fix for you that might make it clear as to why this thing doesn't know how to open a door, or the character hang out, or maybe the protagonist is battling against it, because he does seem to manage some level of control at the end because he has this presumption that he'll be able to keep himself and his family from attacking anybody when help comes.
Are you talking to me?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. So, are there any little things that could happen? Well, I would say that. Boy, I had not thought about this. So maybe I don't want to waste time sitting here
No
thinking.
problem.
So I'll
I'm
pass.
sorry to put you on the
No,
spot
no,
like
all
that.
good. All good.
All right. So Ray brought up this really interesting idea about the backstory, and about how one of the ways the narrative may feel incomplete, or one of the ways the narrative may benefit is from backstory. And he had talked about how it would be potentially difficult to put backstory in, given how the narrative functions now. So I'm going to ask Brad, did you feel also that you needed more backstory? You want to see more backstory? The narrative feels incomplete without it?
I guess it depends on whether or not this was, so if this was intended to be a short story with a complete story arc, then yes, I'd need more backstory, I think. And like I think pretty much like everyone else said, it doesn't feel complete if that's what it is. Now, if this is, say, the opening chapter of a novel or the opening section of a novella, then I probably don't need more backstory. I think, like Ray said, I would be more than happy if it just starts on the plane with Gabe. Gabe biting. Shoot, I forgot the main character's name. Jim. And then, what little bit of information about the fact that the disease was contracted in the jungles of South America could be provided later, but it really wouldn't be that necessary, because it seems to me like the story arc at that point is really about the zombie apocalypse and either how it's defeated or how the human species essentially gets turned into carriers for this fungal intelligence. But yeah, the backstory, I think it depends on whether this is going to be a contained story about Jim's life as a zombie or not.
That makes a lot of sense. Terry, you had brought up that I think from what I got from what you were saying is the little asides where the zombie Jim is reflecting on his life, which are these kind of little spice additions of backstory, were part that you seem to really enjoy. Is that the case?
Yeah, I thought it was really well done. I mean, I think as far as like building sympathy, creating curiosity and interest, I thought the details, I thought the basic storytelling voice, I mean, especially in chapter 3 with the dialogue with the child, very, very good, very effective. But the problem is that made it that much more unsatisfying, chapter 2, that much less satisfying, because it's almost like an intellectual exercise, showing how effective you are at creating, at telling a story, building a character, creating interest, having a good touch, good narrative touch, and then just smashing it with like this dreadful situation. And maybe there is a loophole, and maybe there is a way to bring them back, but that's not the way it's portrayed. And so I mean, at least for me, it was just kind of a punch in the gut. I'm not interested in zombie lore and the mechanics of it and the possibilities that go into it. And I think the nature of the narrative pulls you away from that, because it's so good at pulling you in and just getting you interested in the characters and the dynamics, that it's just a weird combination. And it just didn't, the extent to which it was successful is also the extent to which it made it unsatisfying with the way it was framed, with the main idea. I don't feel like the main idea is great, being inside of a zombie's head and making it much more serious than, if you're gonna do that, then you gotta offer some hope of redemption and lighten some of the stuff, because the more effectively you portray real life and life realities, like you were discussing death with the kid, the more serious the impact of the violence going on. And so
Ray, that because Terry just brought up something really chapter 3, how chapter 3 is this. Well, okay, so let me couch this. Ray, you talked about how interspersing the backstory post action would feel a little maybe forced, or maybe just kind of out of place. Like if we got to the end of chapter 3, then all of a sudden we start learning backstory. If the story continued on, that would be a little bit weird, because we'd be like, oh, let me tell you about my college days. But chapter 3 is maybe a little bit of that, where we have this brutal action and then we move into sort of significant backstory. So how did you feel about the way chapter 3 worked?
Yeah, so that is a interesting point. I guess the way I looked at it, he was recounting the feelings and emotion from the day he died, when he's alive, which I'm not sure if he ever actually died, like his wife did, but that's besides the point. It would seem odd, after eating his child and killing his wife, he would go back to the significance. The drugs really caught me off. I thought that was a comeback in some way. Also, the friendship with Gabe, the trip to Peru was about one paragraph. So as I read through, I thought that it would come back to those in some way. And I just don't see, given the horror and terror and everything that happened, that you hop back into that. It seems like from there, the question everyone has on their mind, and I definitely did, was how does he get out of the apartment? Is everyone else a zombie, or is it just them? Stuff like that, which seems like the logical course of it. So for me, it was the backstory doesn't need to be there. I would like to hear more about it. I'm kind of interested in it. But as far as how you fit that in, it's either going to ruin the hook, or it's going to be kind of awkward and lessen the momentum of the storytelling if it is backtracked later in the story, I think.
Yeah, I'm with you. I want to know what the hell happens when the police show up, or whoever shows up. But just to maybe get a little deeper in what you were saying, did chapter 3 work for you, the way it was set up, the way it where it is in the narrative?
I mean, the writing was absolutely compelling. I pretty much figured it was a zombie thing almost from right at the start, and then somewhere in there it actually says I'm a zombie. And so from there, it did take a lot of the punch out of it. The tension was more from the graphic, vivid scenes of destruction, death. That's what created the tension in me. Kind of like Terry was saying, the suspense of what's going to happen next was no longer there. So it was just kind of enjoying the well-written aspect of chapter 3 more than giving me information about the character itself.
Sure. I can see that. Jared, the beginning of the story, which is something Ray just mentioned, and it's something you had mentioned as well. And I don't know if you had similar feelings to Ray about, we get this character Gabe, we get this backstory with ayahuasca, and then it feels like maybe that gets left behind a little bit. And so it begs the question, where does the narrative need to start? Like, did we actually really need to start back there, etc.? I don't know. What was your thoughts with regard to that?
I think it speaks to the fact that maybe the story is stuck or caught somewhere between a short story and a longer piece, because the way it starts giving us this backstory, it feels like it's trying to fit things in, and kind of explain things. I would say the opening certainly feels like it could only exist to give us the information that's inside of it. And in fact, I don't think the wife or kid is even mentioned until after that. It's really all about, well, this is how he got zombified, kind of. And I also don't know. I don't know how I feel about I can remember it so clear. My last day as a free man, my last day alive. Because that kind of comes up again in the story where he's talking about how Arthur's going to escape and get something, and then the narrator says, "But that's not what happened." Before we find out that's not what happened, and I would definitely, in terms of tension, second guess maybe having that in there. Yeah. So for the intro, I feel like it does feel a bit introductory. It feels like we're not getting to the action. We're kind of doing a little bit of explaining first. So I wouldn't mind getting straight into the action. Either that or starting it farther back and establishing some ground story. If it's a longer work, establishing like him, his wife, his kid, their life, just a little bit. And then we have him going off, he comes back and this happens, because this feels like kind of stuck in the middle in terms of what it's doing.
It sounds like you're saying you want it to be the narrative to be a little tighter, in the sense that the beginning, like you said, does the work of, hey, here's how it becomes a zombie, but that's kind of it, maybe. Like Gabe doesn't come back, the ayahuasca isn't relevant until through the end of the story, and the important emotional hinge the story bends around is the family and their ultimate death. So
Yeah.
seeing them earlier.
Yeah, and if the ayahuasca, that step doesn't come back, or if it's not important to the character, I mean, you could, I think there's plenty of mechanisms by which someone could get an exotic herb that then triggers this kind of stuff, and that seems to be a little bit of a one that requires almost more of an explanation. And if it's not doing some work with character, because if these things don't come back, if it's a short story, for instance, then I would say just get right to the action.
Let me ask you one more thing then. How do you feel about how much we know about Jim's wife, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head?
I think it's Holly. But I remember that because I was looking at a sentence that had the Holy Grail in it, and it reminded me of the name. Yeah, I mean, like you said, this felt like it was purposely pretty plot driven. There, to the extent we get, I mean, we just don't see them as a family before he's a zombie. She's very important to him. He is relying, he doesn't go to hospital and goes to her instead. But yeah, in terms of her independently being set up as a character who has desires or whatnot, I mean, that doesn't feel like the purpose of the story. And so, yeah, so I guess, yeah, she's not fleshed out, pun intended, I guess. Is that a pun? And I didn't really miss it. But I didn't miss it. I wasn't like, I want to know more about it, just because it didn't seem like this type of story with what it was.
Sure. I don't know if that was a pun, but I'll take it. We'll call it fine. Brad, you had talked about the characters standing around it toward the ending, and I tried to interview everybody about it because I have a similar question. So I don't know if you have more to say on that, but I want to hear if now that you've heard more of what people have said and maybe you thought about it more or whatever else. Do you have any other things you want to say on that?
No, not really. I mean, it didn't, that left me with a lot of questions about, well, I mean, it just, yeah, because I thought there would be movement outside that might catch the zombie's attention or something like that. There'd be people. I mean, I'm assuming if it's an apartment, the windows look out either into a courtyard where there might be animals or someone might walk a dog or out onto the street. And so invariably at some point, someone would walk by or something would walk by or fly by and they'd see it and it would get their attention. So I didn't, and it seemed like days had passed and I realized it was gray and foggy and whatnot, but even in the hardest rain, you can see, a couple 100 feet and someone would be like rushing by to their car or something. So I guess it left me with too many questions to be satisfying, I guess, as to why they would be there in the apartment. Now, I guess if they had served their purpose of transferring the disease or something as far as they could, then, then I guess that resolves it. But I didn't know that was kind of like part of the story. So no, and clearly, I think the very last sentence says, because I think Jim is kind of thinking about, what will happen, whether they can be rescued, whether there'll be a cure, and then I think it's like Jared had mentioned, it was another one of these sentences where it says, but that's not what happened, or things got worse, and so clearly, there's more story about Jim coming later, so. So yeah, I just, I guess I don't know. It's just, I didn't understand why they were standing around if something was coming up later, unless the standing around part, is explained in the next segment.
Well, in defense of the story, I will say I thought that I would definitely agree with some of the not criticism, but points about how there is a little foreshadowing is maybe a bit not heavy-handed. I'm not sure how to say what I want to say, but it does explicitly imply to you what's going to happen in a way that may not be foreshadowing, is more of a direct statement. But I think the ending is a pretty strong bit of foreshadowing, where he's like, "I was so naive," and I actually thought that was a bit of an echoing ending that I disagree. I have maybe comments on other parts of that ending, but I thought that was okay. But let me ask you, Brad, since we're on the ending, how did you feel about the character, the protagonist Jim's thoughts that he could control himself when help came? How did that seem to you?
Yeah, well, and and I have to say, I did not the statements, about being naive or things would not work out the way. Those statements didn't bother me. I did not think that they took away from any of the tension for me. And yeah, I suppose. I think I do. That was one of the compelling parts of the story was, Jim is like trapped. And so the only thing he can do is kind of like try to think of a way out of the situation, because he's not in control of the body. He can't set himself to some task, so I guess, like in Matt Damon's words from The Martian, he's kind of doing the math, and as much as he can, he's thinking about problem solving, or like how to resolve the situation. So yeah, I guess it makes perfect sense that if you're trying to be hopeful, that you would, be thinking that someone might find a cure, that someone's going to figure it out, and then they're going to save you. It makes sense that you'd have those thoughts, because otherwise, what? You would have just given up then.
Yeah, no, I think you have a really good point. And I didn't see a lot of the problem solving when he's stuck inside the body. And to be fair, he's in the middle of a very gruesome of events for a lot of it. But I think that's actually really, I'm trying to think of the Marsh, like Andy Weir writing guy trapped in zombie trying to science the shit out of his way out of that situation. That actually is a really interesting premise. But it's 7:46, so let me bring in the author, Ian. You've been fantastic. How do you? I am not as quiet as you, so I always appreciate when authors are better than me at this. But Do you have any questions for us? Any comments so far?
That's a good question. I want to briefly explain a little bit more about what drew me to the premise and the story in terms of how that's going to propel the plot forward. I'm hearing that it's not functioning as a short story, which I could have foreseen. The opening does a lot of laying the groundwork for breadcrumbs that somebody later will piece together to be able to figure out the origin of this thing. Like in terms of a global outbreak of zombiedom, this is how it starts. It starts with this weird thing that happens, and then an international airport or two later, where a guy's biting a few people, and those are all the vectors that somebody smarter down the road would piece together. But my beef with zombie fiction or the zombie fantasy is it allows us to indulge in the idea of being totally justified in killing other people. It lets us imagine a world where we can pick up a machine gun and mow down hordes of other people and feel good about it because they're evil and they're irredeemable and they're just going to eat us. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to explore the possibility that the worst enemy is actually still just a person in different circumstances, potentially in circumstances they can't control. So having the zombie parasite or the pathogen there controlling their behavior was something that will be the main focus, the main struggle of the larger story. Would be trying to figure out to uncover that mystery, to figure out that puzzle, and to learn how to communicate with the person inside. So Jim here is patient 1, Gabe is patient 0. I don't think that Gabe is going to be retrievable, but Jim maybe will have a chance to tell his story and he'll be able to start it this way. But in terms of directions to go forward with this character, the reason the story ends where it does is that you guys are all very astute in your writing challenges, that like with a character that has 0 external agency, what can he do? He can't do anything. He's a completely passive character on the outside. And so I wonder if it would be worthwhile to continue Jim's story and talk about like how you either go completely insane or you meditate your way to enlightenment when you're trapped inside of a zombie, or if it would be a good introduction to the world, and then I should shift focus to different characters farther down the line in the outbreak, and then we can start building the plot of discovering that zombies are still people inside, discovering a cure or working out a cure, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of figuring out direction going forward. But I hear it's really solid feedback about this opening piece, and confirms that this is not a short story. It may be a novella, it may be a novel. I have a novel that's set in the same world, but I'm not happy with it. So I'd be interested in talking about how to move forward with this one, or this section there. So at risk of rambling on, I'm going to mute myself and let the conversation pick.
No, that was great. I found a lot of what you said really informative. I'm wondering if maybe you can condense what you said into a question or two for us.
I would like to just say that I agree with what Ian said about zombie movies being a vehicle. It's the same with alien movies too, or robot movies. It's a vehicle for allowing someone to go out with a machine gun and slaughter, thousands of other things, but not attributing any sort of kind of like rights or life to them. It's one of the things I love so much about the movie Ex Machina. It kind of raises that question, about like, do you really have the right to kill something just because, it's not really on the same level, of either consciousness or sentience or rights as you. But so I love that. I just wanted to say I like that idea generally, that it's going to raise the question of the fact that these are still people, and they probably don't deserve to just be killed as nothing.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, I still think that there's something really problematic here, and that's that it's almost worse. I mean, I laud the intention, to create more person sensitivity, but then to build up the sensitivity and smash them anyway, I would prefer just blowing up a monster, or someone, or obviously the whole concept of the zombie and someone being turned into a monster has ethical confusion built into it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, if there were some clues, if there were some clues along the way that he could be revived or they could be revived even in the middle of chapter 2, that would soften the blow. At that point there might be a reason to look forward and to get invested in a future outcome. But it's just it's so painful, to stir up the the stories of these people and the humanity of them, and then just mash them. I mean, that's such a problem for me. Anyway,
Reminds me of Ender's Game, like in that question of killing things. But I was going to say, I think, Ian, if you get back to your questions, which I think was, if you're going to continue it, should it go on with the zombie, kind of like figure out what happened in that part of it, or should it be focused on Jim moving on and kind of either be about him going insane or achieving enlightenment through being a zombie? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and also to Terry's point, if we should look forward to a resolution for Jim that may not involve him dying as a zombie, although most zombies do that. It's worse for the zombies than it is for the people surviving in a zombie apocalypse. Let's put it that way.
Well, so for the first one about going forward, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. If it's a longer piece, sustaining it with a protagonist who has no outward agency would be tough. Just in terms of how long, even in this shorter piece, there were a number of times where he kind of thought like, I wanted to do this, but I couldn't. And, even in that shorter space, I was kind of like, okay, like that's getting a little bit repetitive maybe. So I think it would probably be easier to do it the way you're saying, with expanding out into a bigger world and having it be the people who are trying to stop the zombie apocalypse and having it then intersect with him. And even, you could see dual narratives where there's maybe one that Jim comes back every so often. That's probably what you're thinking, I would guess. And then the wider world is happening around that. That would certainly be interesting.
What do you think about that, Ray?
Well, you brought up a few different avenues. I just want to say I love Zombie Buddha. I would read that for sure. And also the other way, the descent into madness, where you just have the terror of his mind descend more and more and more into these philosophical dark spaces would also be intriguing. But continuing with Jim, the main thing, I guess, the whole crux of my criticism is that the first person, if you're going to explain with other characters, I always find the use of different narration voices a little tricky, because then you're bringing the narration as part of the story rather than letting the story kind of speak for itself. And sometimes that can be seen as just a device rather than an essential part of the story. So maybe, if it was going to go back into different avenues, a third person narration might be more useful. It would ruin the immediacy of this piece here. I feel like a first person narration would be more appropriate, just being linear in its storytelling.
Wow, what a great point, Jared. You had said that potentially bringing in more people could be helpful. How do you feel about that, considering that the aspect that Ray just brought up about point of view?
I hadn't thought about it at all. Very good point.
Me either, right? But that's a
Yeah.
great point. Oh, now that he's brought it up, do you have any thoughts about
Me?
it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that is hard. That would be tough to bring in different voices. This voice I certainly thought was distinct. Maybe a bit jokey for what was going on. I was a little confused by that at times. We kind of mentioned thinking about life insurance, or thinking about how the stewardess presses the buttons and comes to the right seat when someone presses a button in the midst of all this madness. But then, yeah, as someone who's written, or I wrote it unsuccessfully externally, a book where there were multiple points of view, and it was in the third person, and it kind of dipped into their try to get to close third. It was certainly messy, and I'm not sure how it ended up working. But there's certainly authors who do it, and authors who do dueling first person narratives and make it work. I can't think of it right now, but I know it's been done, and so I don't think it's like, something to not try. But yeah.
I was going to say this. I think it is possible. And I think Colin's the only other person that I know of that said that he had read the books by N.K. Jemisin, the Stone Earth trilogy, I think, or gosh, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but I think there's a third person, a second person, and a first person point of view woven throughout all three of these books. And she does a great job. And I think it's incredibly compelling. It's a great story. So you can definitely, I think, pull it off. And I could see a story where Jim occasionally, like, I completely agree with what Ian said. I have this thought in my notes, is that it's just, without being able to have any kind of physical agency, you can't be the main point of view character. But if he's there occasionally, having thoughts about what's going on around him, and kind of, like philosophizing about, his predicament, I could see that fitting into the larger narrative, where he might be describing what other people are doing that he sees, or maybe, it's kind of a distant, third person, the things that happen around Jim. I could see that. I think that would work, or could work.
Can I pitch my device and you guys can give me just a thumbs up or thumbs down? Because
Yeah, jump on in.
I was going to say, let me wait for consent before I just assume it. So Jim has to be tracked down by the people who are working on the cure, who have figured out a way to communicate with the people who are trapped inside zombies. And so the way that I would make that work by cheating is to have the characters in the other plot eventually track Jim down and try to get his narrative account, his like recollection of the way that things happened back from as early as the initial outbreak, for either posterity, or because they're going to try a cure and they don't know if it's going to work, or just another interview kind of context. So would that fly, or would it need to be explained sooner than a reveal later? Because like that's kind of tipping your hand that they figure out a way to communicate inside, if I make it clear to the reader that that's why we have this contemporary Jim perspective. But if it were interspersed that way and I explained it that way, would that be satisfying by the time we got there, which is a big hypothetical.
So the framing device is that there's an outer story, which is third person, and that's focused on the people who are finding Jim. And then
That's
we
correct.
at some point realize that what the first person narrative is kind of like a journal or an interview account of what's happening.
It's like Interview with the Zombie. Yeah. After the fact.
Okay. Anybody want to answer that question? We can just go around the group. Brad, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know what I think about that. I think it could work. It'd be difficult to read. I would say that if it ends up that they find Jim and we have Jim's point of view as and while he's still a zombie, and the people are working to cure him, that to me, that seems like that works really well. If Jim only comes back after he's been cured and he's kind of recounting like things that happened, yeah, I think that could work. Yeah, I don't see why it couldn't work. There'd be a lot of storytelling, I guess, through flashbacks, which I guess Interview with the Vampire worked really well. Really popular when it was first published, so I don't see why it essentially couldn't be replicated.
Ray, what about you?
So the way I kind of heard it was, we kind of get this glimpse into Jim's mind. Then we're going to hop into a third person narrative with this team tracking down the virus, what happened. And eventually they figure out a way to hear what Jim is thinking inside of his head. And so in that case, you're going to have to make what happened beforehand in Peru and all the backstory to that hidden from the reader for it to really have an impact. And it's all going to come at the end, I guess. So that's the way I kind of can envision it happening. I don't really see a interview with a vampire thing happening because he's not really a lucid or cognitive. So that's kind of what I kind of heard from Ian, and I think that could be workable, but you know, the devil's in the details how it's executed.
Terry?
I think it would just have to go from a different perspective. I think the story would have to focus on those people seeking solutions and experiencing dangers and overcoming some of them. And Jim's story, you know, depending on whether the wife or the child ever got cured themselves, could just be you know, a pitiful extreme that underlines, you know, the seriousness of the situation and could make the overall scheme interesting. But to jump right into, you know, to third degree horror, you know, in the second chapter, really amped up to a I mean, the more you stir up the pathos of the innocent victims and then the helplessness of the perpetrator, I mean, that's nasty stuff to encounter in a second chapter unless you've got a taste for this kind of thing. But from a perspective of overcoming and people working on solutions, then it becomes interesting. Then it becomes, you know, a quest and an emergency and other things that it isn't right now, because right now it's just a tragedy. It's a weird tragedy, but right now it looks like a weird tragedy, and I don't know that tragedies, especially with most modern readers, are the kind of thing to propel them forward.
Jared? Yeah. Oh, yeah. In answer to Ian's question about using a framing device and having this third person, I know you kind of spoke on it a little bit, but
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that like Ray, I might be waffle. I don't know. Kind of say that it depends on the execution, but I think it would just be then how to make the opening actually logically seem like something that would be in response to interview questions, or you know, if it's it, you know, it would be something where, yeah, but it seems cool. Like I wouldn't certainly, if I found out that was the case later, I think it would be really cool if it worked, like to have that kind of framing device. I'm always a fan of things where it lets you go back and go, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So that kind of serotonin patting your own head, you know, is one of my favorite things in a book. So if it worked, I think it'd be great.
fantastic. All right, Ian, you've got 4 opinions. I think they're all pretty much in favor of your concept. Okay, so we're at 8:04. Does anybody have any final things they didn't get a chance to say, including the author?
I'd like to hear more about, you know, I'd like to spend more time with Jim and his family's life. I mean, that, you know, we didn't get a lot of opportunity with that. And I have to, you know, emphasize how well you did that. I mean, just how enjoyable the storytelling voices and, you know, and the level of detail. I mean, you know, just how deep you did or didn't go was really good. You had it at a nice comfortable range, and the stories are very engaging. So
Yeah, I would second that. There's some beautiful characterization work in there, and I was definitely hungering for more, especially given the intensity of the physical action. It always seems like, you know, when you have a family specifically, it's almost like it's hard to have a kid if you don't have strong characterization, just because the nature of that is so intense. At least for me, I always want to see a lot more of the feelings involved. And I think maybe to something that Ian brought up earlier about the possibility of sticking with Jim about a character that has no agency. I can imagine a narrative where if we know more about Jim, if there's more stakes than just the surface, not surface, but the plot. There's some term for this, the external journey. If there's more about his internal journey, there's more about this. The narrative would be primarily inside his own head, and as such, would be the stakes would have to be internal, and those remain a little underdeveloped maybe at this point. And if those were more developed, then the scenes we read as an opening are almost like the crescendo and climax to a different narrative where we learn about Jim and we learn about his family and we grow to find affection for him. I mean, at this point, we don't know a lot about who he is as a person, other than some basic details. And to have this level of action without those, it almost feels like he's not the central character. Because in narratives I can think of, when you have this level of action early on, it's as a setup to like the kid's story or some other character. It becomes a tragic backstory for the person who will ultimately follow through the rest of the narrative. So I think you've got some great ideas, and I agree with Terry. I would love to see more about the family. Brad, Ray, Jared, do you guys have any final thoughts?
Well, I would definitely, I would second what Terry said. I thought the storytelling with Jim and his thoughts about his family really made me care. I think that's one of the things that made me so terrified about reading further, was I realized how much he loved his family, and I did not want to read, the next passage where he murders them or something like that, because he obviously cared about them. And so it was like this mix of compelling writing, but then this like terror that I felt. So yeah, I would second. I thought that the writing and the conveyance of Jim's feelings, I thought was done very well, and yeah, and if that can be retained and part of a greater story, I think that could fit. But I also agree with what Terry said, and the fact that, yeah, I would be most interested in the story, obviously, and I think Ian already mentioned this, is the story has to be with the people that are trying to cure this. And so Jim is just a part of that greater story.
All right, well, we're 8:08. I think I can speak for everybody when I say thank you so much, Ian, for letting us read this. This was great.
Yes, thank you. Ian.
And thanks everybody for reading. And I'll be more thorough with my content warnings in the future.
All right.
I think you got a good content warning on that one.
Hey, I am curious though about one weird thing, and it has nothing to do with the story, but did anyone else, I don't know if it's because I use OpenOffice and then I converted it to PDF to read it on my Kindle, but what I ended up reading was like one paragraph per page, and the last sentence of every paragraph was like, it was justified such that it was like several words spread out across the entire line. Am I the only one that experienced that? Nope. Right.
No,
I got that same thing on the PDF. Yeah.
Yeah, but not the one paragraph per page thing. There was just toward the end, but I thought that was like a poetry thing where he was structuring a sentence for effect.
When I first looked at the document, I was like, 90 pages, what the hell? And I thought this is some really interesting like style that Ian's trying out, where it's, then I started reading it. I was like, I think this is like a glitch in my formatting or something like that.
I'm going to stop the recording. Not that I don't think they should live on in posterity, but here I go.